Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today for the second day of the qualifying exams prep weekend. My name is Arline Votruba. I am a senior consultant at the Center for Writing and Rhetoric. I've been here for a couple of years now, and I am a doctoral candidate in the Cultural Studies Department, working on my dissertation, but I just passed my qualifying exams in May of 2022. So I share that to say that I come to this time around with the experience of having gotten through the process. And I know each of you here today will get through it as well. So don't let the fear of the scariness that is qualifying exams get in your way. Just take it one step at a time. That's the only way that you can accomplish a project of this kind of caliber, is just to focus on the little pieces. So today I'm going to present on one of those pieces, which is qualifying examinations questions, and then also with questions in mind, thinking about how to approach the process of developing questions and answers for your upcoming exams. So how to kind of anticipate questions or draft them depending on the format of your qualifying exams, and then how to get started preparing answers. I also just want to let you know, sometimes I don't notice the chat as much while presenting. So if you do have a question relevant to a particular slide, please just interrupt me. That's perfectly fine. So to begin, how do I start? A question that I had when I got to the qualifying exams phase, as well as I think a lot of us have, where do I even begin? How do I even begin this thing? So first and foremost, if you have not done so already, review your department handbook and all available quals related information. I know as someone in the Cultural Studies Department that they have a pre-recorded seminar on basically qualifying exams process that gives a lot of information there. So maybe look to the SharePoint related to your department, see if they have something of that sort. Otherwise, look at your department handbook and the section on qualifying exams. Maybe you've never read it to this point, but now that you're at this phase, it is the time to do so. Familiarize yourself with all the, requirements. And if you have questions, write them down and connect with your program director or with your advisor to ask, or the chair of your quals committee to ask questions that you need clarification on as you get started. Having an overview or full scope of the requirements and process is going to help you as you move through this process. Speak with your committee about the layout of the examination and develop a timeline if you will help create the questions. So once we move post coursework, one of the most challenging pieces is that there's no longer the structure of timed deadlines, set requirements for when you'll show up to class or when you'll pass in your papers. And so you need to be your own disciplined maker of deadlines. And so I encourage you to draw out a timeline and make sure that you communicate with your committee about that timeline to ensure that you're all on the same page and that what you're looking at is doable. I said before we started recording that often it takes about a year to do qualifying exams, at least in the School of Arts and Humanities. That may vary from department to department, and you may have a different timeline if you are working full time in addition to doing this, or if you have other obligations in your life, and that's okay. So also remember that there's no right or wrong timeline as long as your committee's on board and it works for you. Connect with other students who have successfully completed quals in your department to discuss the process. I will tell you that the only reason I managed to get through quals was, one, because I talked to people who had already done it and asked them for examples if they were willing to share some of their qual submissions. I asked them to tell me about their interactions working with my advisor on their committee. I asked them about their process, and I learned so much from other students. So please don't be shy to reach out to someone that you know who has gone through this and ask them if you could just meet for a quick chat about the process, or even if they're willing to share any samples or examples. In addition to connecting with students who have successfully completed quals, I also encourage you to see if there's anyone currently working on quals in your department that you can link up with even to have like a group chat where you check in every once in a while and talk about the process, or if you do have time to do some kind of Zoom check-in, but having someone who's going through the process with you, I think humanizes it and also helps maintain motivation, because then you have an accountability buddy to check in with and say, you know, what have you been working on? How's it going? And to just touch base or ask questions. Use your annotations and study materials as a foundation to your preparation. So at this point, you've been in coursework for a while, you have previously written notes and have a lot of study materials that you've gathered. So I encourage you to use that as a starting point for your preparation. Maybe you're further along, you've already developed your lists, you already know the topics that you're planning to discuss. And so you have annotations of text directly from your qualifying exams reading list, and those will serve as a foundation to your preparation. And then finally, use what you know. This advice, I think, spans all of post-course work. Don't set yourself up to have to take on adapting to whole new areas within your discipline or learning whole new processes, such as, for me, for an example, everyone has told me use Zotero. It's a resource management, reference management tool. And, you know, they say it'll save you so much time in the end. But for me, I have such an ongoing process of organizing my files on my desktop and in my hard drive to keep myself on track. And I have my own spreadsheets that I use with a source matrices where I keep all my bibliographic information, that to me, it doesn't feel as productive to now take on another project of learning how to use Zotero and transferring all that stuff over. So for me, it's not useful at this time in my life. Maybe it is for you, but using what you know, the point is, don't take on a million new projects just because you're at this phase. Instead, stick to what you know, what works for you. Even knowing things like when you work best or how you work best, using that information to drive your process is going to be really important. Again, stick to what you know. Less is more. Good enough is good enough. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If I can, you know, get any message through today, you know, not even specifically related to questions, but the process of quals in and of itself is, it's not as scary as you think. You can do it. Many have done it before you. You're going to get through this. Just do what you have to do and don't worry about things being perfect, because nothing is ever perfect. So to begin, we need to think about, what is your question path? Every department is different. Everyone has different requirements, and within departments, sometimes there's variation. So make sure that you're aware of your question path. If you don't know the answer to this question already, it's something for you to follow up with your committee later this week or maybe later this month to make sure you're all on the same page. The different types of question paths include: one, that you do not and will not know what questions are going on the exam. When you don't know what questions are going on the exam, the challenge is understanding what's important for me to prepare. How can I prepare when I have no idea what's coming? And another challenge is the scope. How broad, general, or specific will the questions be? And so preparing for an exam where you don't have any sense of what the questions are going to be can be overwhelming because of the unknown. But we will talk later about strategies for preparing responses and partial answers for questions, even if you don't know what question you'll be asked. Another type of question path would be that you're given advance notice of the questions, or at least the kinds of questions. So sometimes professors will give you a general question and then they add a little bit of variation when they submit the final exam, and you'll know what questions are going to appear on the exam. The challenge: should you write answers ahead of time and memorize them, or should you go in with basic outlines? This also speaks to the type of exam you're taking. Some people do a 24-hour take-home exam, others have a timed exam on campus, and sometimes it's somewhere in between. And so if you have a take-home exam, you may have much more of an opportunity to prepare written answers and have them available to you. Whereas if you're going on campus to a proctored exam that's timed, you may need to memorize a bit more, or at least prepare and memorize so that you're familiar with what you will write. Going in with basic outlines might come up, might be something useful to you. I'd say for most people, making some basic outlines is a useful preparation strategy, even just to start brainstorming and thinking through how to connect all the materials you've read. And then the other question path is that you and your committee work together to develop a selection of questions that you'll choose from on the day of. This was my question path. I came up with, I believe, maybe 4 questions with my committee members that we kind of worked back and forth to revise and refine and narrow down the questions. And then once we selected those 4 questions, I knew on the day of the exam, they would tell me to either answer 2 or 3 of those questions. Sometimes they would say, answer any of these 4 questions, or they sometimes would say, answer this question and then pick from these 3 and answer 2. So it kind of depends. There could be a combination. There might be some required. There may be some more options depending on your professors. Again, getting all that information ahead of time will really help you. In the case that you and your committee work together to develop a question and then you get to choose from them on the day of, a challenge can be how to even develop questions that your committee members will like or agree to. Similarly, there's that question of how much should you prepare prior to the exam day, which hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have a clearer idea of how to address some of these challenges. Although I'll say I can't tell you exactly how you should, because each individual's process and experience is going to be a little bit different. So it's going to vary person to person, but these are some ideas we can at least explore and give you a better sense. How can you prepare responses? Great question. I think it feels a little overwhelming when we first sit down preparing quals and trying to decide like how does one prepare if I don't know the questions, or how do I even prepare the answers if I do know the questions, but I don't know which ones they'll ask. One thing you can do is develop potential questions as a practice. So even if you don't know the questions, just thinking about what are the main themes or the major issues that are coming up throughout the text I'm reading. And when you develop the potential questions with themes in mind, it'll help you consider those major issues in your field and help you to organize your readings. So as early as the first reading that you do for quals, I encourage you to keep a list of keywords or major themes that are coming up, so that as time goes on, you'll see where there's overlap so that you can anticipate, okay, it seems like the majority of my texts are addressing, the same theme. So I should be prepared to talk about that in a qual, whether it's a question or a part of an answer that I'm going to cover. And then preparing partial answers that you may use to respond to a variety of questions. We'll talk about a little more in depth later how to do this, but by preparing partial answers, even writing a few paragraphs or a few ideas, excuse me, can help you practice writing responses, can give you a sense of how long it takes you to write those types of responses, and offers an opportunity to reflect and analyze what you've learned. Excuse me, I just need to take a sip of water. Awesome. Keep in mind. So a couple things to keep in mind when going through this process of anticipating or drafting questions and answers is, what are some of the goals of qualifying examinations? Why are we even doing this? So some of the reasons for qualifying exams is to help just demonstrate to your committee that you have the organizational and argumentation skills to synthesize ideas from what you've read and translate that into an argument that may be a few pages or several pages, depending on the typical requirements. And that brings to mind just another thing to touch base with your committee on is how many pages is typical for people to submit per question or per exam. Having in mind a number of pages is not the only measure of figuring out like what you need to write or how much you need to write, but it's one way to just help you see, like, should I be prepared to write 5 pages or should I be prepared to write 10? It kind of gives you a sense of what you're really aiming at. So one of the goals of quals is really just displaying that you are able to do able to write an organized and persuasive argument. Another goal of quals is to engage your examiners in a scholarly conversation within the field. I think that many times there is a discrepancy or kind of a advice from committees to keep quals and your dissertation as separate entities, or to not be thinking too far ahead about your dissertation when you're working on quals. Personally, I would instead say, think of quals as a launch pad for your dissertation. And so while you may or may not engage with the same ideas from quals in your dissertation, anytime that it does relate, thinking about how you can engage your examiners in the scholarly conversation within the field and bring them into the area that you plan to discover more through your dissertation is a great way to start that conversation with your committee, to start getting a sense of what they think of your ideas, what feedback they have about some of your approaches, ideas, thoughts on a topic, and to kind of get them into the space of where you're coming from for the research that you plan to do. But in any case, it's really trying to just not just write a paper that's like, I read this, and here's the major themes, but rather engage a scholarly conversation where you're actually analyzing and pushing your reader to maybe reconsider how they think about a text because you're offering your lens or your reading of it. This, comes up with the next one, which is demonstrating your critical thinking and analytical skills. I don't think it's very common for someone to fail the qualifying exams or to have to do them again. But I think in the instances that I've heard that folks do need to rewrite them or need to do it a second time is because they don't do enough analysis and critical thinking. They rely more on the previously mentioned strategy of, I read this, and this, and they said this, and this. So like, we're not just summarizing, but we're engaging with the text and we're offering our analysis, and we're really trying to engage with and deepen the understanding of how these texts are working together or part of a scholarly trajectory. The quals also serve to prove that you have both breadth and depth of knowledge in the field. So again, it's not enough to say I've read these 100 books, but how in depth do you now understand the concepts, the themes, the major arguments, the major shifts in the field? One way to think about this that I found helpful is that often the professors would tell me, each qualifying exam is to prepare you so you could then teach a course in that area. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it, because it's like, you need to know some of the basics or some of the, like foundational texts in the area. And then you need to know some more specialized topics within the area so that you'd have the plethora of knowledge and familiarity to be able to teach an engaging course on it. And then exhibit your preparedness to teach a course on the exam field, being able to, at the end of this, feel confident creating a syllabus based on the types of readings that you had included. You are not expected to prove that you know everything there is to know about your field or any of the fields that are part of your qualifying exams. Nobody knows everything there is to know about any field. It's just showing that you are well-versed and becoming the expert in those areas. What can help prepare for exams? So developing potential questions, developing partial answers, and developing answer steps are a few of the items we'll address in the remainder of this session. The qualifying exam questions brainstorming worksheet is available in the Center for Writing and Rhetoric Canvas page. You can pull up that document if you wish to coincide with the remainder of this session. The handout that I just mentioned, it's on the Canvas. I would go there. And we can start kind of brainstorming some ideas as we go through. So we're going to talk about some types of questions. One of the types of questions would be a simple question with smart answers. In other words, I sometimes think of it as more like a broad or general question with specific answers. So something like, what is cultural studies? Or what is the field or discipline that you have, read in? Or how do practitioners do cultural studies? How do the scholars in your field do or approach that field? Right now, let's just take a few seconds. You can jot down some ideas of simple questions related to your exam field and topics. Maybe you just focus on one of the fields you're working on studying for, or you try and write one question per field. But I'm just going to give you a few seconds now to write down right off the top of your head, doesn't have to be perfect, a couple of simple questions that may come up for your particular area. If you came up with one question and you're feeling courageous, please just share the question in the chat. It's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just showing some examples will help each other have a sense of like, what are some of the simple questions we could be asking? We already have one question saying, when does modern Spanish history start? This would be an interesting question to answer because I'm guessing that that might be debatable. When does it start? Maybe there's different, scholars who would argue that it starts in different times. And so this would be, an interesting question to be able to engage with. I would say making sure whatever questions you pose are debatable. So the types of questions, even when it's simple, it should not be something that the answer is completely obvious, but rather that you need to construct your argument to provide the evidence for why. What are the time boundaries of early modern studies? Why are these the limits? Great. I think that this is, again, having it be something that's debatable. You'll be having to point to the text to address the answers to these questions. And often questions do have multiple parts. So having that follow-up of why are these the limits would be a great kind of jumping off point. Another type of question that we may come across are so-and-so says questions, or a he said, she said type of question. So here I have kind of a longer example just to show you what this might look like. So Michelle Alexander says, quote, but if the movement that emerges to end mass incarceration does not meaningfully address the racial divisions and resentments that gave rise to mass incarceration, and if it fails to cultivate an ethic of genuine care, compassion, and concern for every human being of every class, race, and nationality within our nation's borders, including poor whites, who are often pitted against poor people of color, the collapse of mass incarceration will not mean the death of the racial caste in America, unquote. What other cultural studies and critical race scholars is Alexander in conversation with? What is Alexander's argument in response to, and how do you interpret her charge? Provide relevant evidence and citations where necessary. This may be one approach of finding a quote or a concept that's covered by one author and then asking how it is in conversation with others. Another way to approach a so-and-so question, so-and-so says question, would be, one author approaches, cultural studies with, such and such in mind, whereas others have pushed back and instead think of cultural studies as requiring, this type of focus. And then, where do you fall on this argument? Or can you provide evidence for where cultural studies, has emerged from, or something like that? So I know my examples, I'm kind of sharing like broad, open-ended, like fill in the blanks type things, but so-and-so says questions would be engaging with a few ideas or a couple ideas, or maybe a quote from the field, and then trying to put it into conversation with others. I'll pause and give you a couple of minutes. This one may take longer to come up with examples, but you can even think off the top of your head of a couple of the texts that you read that are in conversation with each other and highlight, that this author spoke to this theme and so did this one, and then coming up with a question based on that. And you can go find any relevant quotes or materials like that later when you have more time to brainstorm. I'll give just a few seconds to wrap up your thoughts. If you came up with something, feel free to share in the chat. Otherwise, I know it's a very kind of brief brainstorm, but you can come back and spend more time working with the worksheet after our session. I just want to make sure I cover all the ideas. Some questions may speak to you more or be more engaging or interesting, maybe give you more of a sense of, oh, I want to talk about that. And that is the type of question that I would write if you have the opportunity to create your own questions. So for example, another type of question is a public facing question on contemporary issues. And for many, this might feel more relevant, maybe something that's really, enticing to discuss. So one example of a public facing question may look like something like this. You are invited to speak about intersectionality on a podcast about workplace politics. Keeping your audience in mind, explain the dominant theories about intersectionality, how different scholars and activists have used intersectionality, and how you think this information fits into conversations about workplace politics today. Sometimes these public-facing questions, you can imagine the genre of perhaps speaking on a news station or being a commenter on a documentary of a particular area of study, or here like a podcast. So public-facing questions, I'm going to give you again just a few minutes to jot down an idea of what kinds of questions you may write for this and what kinds of topics emerge from it. As we brainstorm ideas of questions, you may just want to do some bullet points of the themes that come to mind that would be, applicable to this type of question. Anything that you can get written down as just a jumping off point. But again, I know I'm not giving enough time to really think in depth about it, to the point where you're going to come up with the types of questions you pose to your professor and your committee to see if they approve, but just a jumping off point. And then you can maybe spend time during one of the work blocks later today using the worksheet and going more in depth to try and hone in on these questions. More kinds of questions include lit review questions. If you already know your dissertation topic and you have designed your qualifying exam to be very directly aligned with your dissertation topic, I think a lit review question can be very effective and be proactive in helping you with the lit review. So a lit review question may be something like, more than many other academic disciplines, the field of cultural studies and feminist studies has had to directly confront shifting social and political ideologies regarding gender. Where would you locate the beginnings of the modern field of feminist studies, and what major advances, arguments have marked its development? Again, jot down ideas for the types of topics and questions that you may think of as useful in developing questions that would drive writing some kind of a lit review. To ensure that I have time to go through everything and we have time for questions about my presentation at the end, I'm going to kind of keep moving through. But so more kinds of questions. And if any of these prompt something in you, feel free to jot down your ideas. Methodological questions. So questions about methods, something like, what are some of the primary methodological approaches in the field of cultural studies that scholars employ? Discuss also the relative merits or strengths and limitations of the transdisciplinary methods used in cultural studies work. This type of question example could easily be substituted with your field or one of the sub fields that you are using for your quals, and focusing on something of the typical, approaches in their methods. So whereas cultural studies is transdisciplinary, maybe one of your fields has a different kind of drive or overall kind of typical approach that you may emphasize, and asking about like, what are the strengths and limitations of that approach. Methods questions, again, can be useful in preparation for quals and the dissertation, in the sense that it can give you time to really analyze and understand how the work is done in your field to help you prepare for developing your own methodological approach to your research. Another kind of question, a theory question. So something like, what is literary theory's relationship to cultural studies? What cultural studies scholars have engaged in literary theory, and in what ways? How has literary theory contributed to shaping the field of cultural studies? Your theory question could be more specific to a particular theory as well. That's fine. I know the types of questions that I have as examples tend to be more broad strokes of the field, but I think often professors are also open to you being really grounded in a text or grounded in a couple of texts, and your question coming from really particular, theories within the work or ideas within the work. So don't be shy to be more specific. If there's a theory that you're going to employ in your research in the future and you want to spend time writing about it, maybe ask a question more geared towards that particular theory. So moving away from the questions towards answers, we're going to shift our thinking. And again, please use the worksheet after this session to take time and give yourself a chance to really draft questions. I personally used this handout when drafting my initial questions, came up with maybe 10 questions, refined, edited, narrowed it down to maybe like 6 questions. And then I sent those questions to my professor. And then the professor looked at them, said which ones that they felt were, more in line with what they would typically ask on a qual, or that they thought were useful. And then, we worked together to refine them and edit them to be more reflective of the types of language that the professor would use in the questions. And then that's how we came to it and agreed upon it. So drafting your ideas for questions now, even if you're in the beginning phase of studying for quals, is totally appropriate. I'd say once you get a little bit into reading a few, maybe like a third of the text on a list is a good time to talk to your professor about the questions. I personally lean towards preparing questions earlier as better, for the fact that then when you're reading, you can be anticipating what types of information or what types of examples from the text are going to be applicable to the exam responses that you write. So when we think about answers versus answer steps, we're thinking about how to prepare what you will write. How do you prepare for it? And how do you maybe even prepare samples or small pieces of writing that can then be adapted for the responses of your quals? Even if you don't know the exact questions that you'll be answering, you can prepare for certain arguments and explanations that you'll have to make no matter what. So you can assume that in your exams, you'll be talking about the field, key themes, key terms and theories in your field, key scholars and developments in your field. So if you notice as you're reading that there's a clear shift, that, things kind of go in a new direction at the intervention of one scholar or maybe a few scholars, that's something to take note of and be prepared to reflect on. Terms, things that emerge in terms of, driving theories within the area, being prepared to discuss them is going to be helpful. One piece of advice I was offered when preparing for quals was to read the text in chronological order. Depending on what your field is, this may or may not be a great way to go. I think in some areas, it makes more sense to make your qualifying exam list into themes and reading those themes in order. Whereas in something like my cultural studies list, which was my major field list, reading it in chronological order was really helpful because it helped me to better understand the trajectory of the field, or how the field transitioned from the early beginnings to contemporary cultural studies work. In terms of answers versus answer steps, we can think about some of the questions that we came up with in the brainstorm, something like, how do practitioners do cultural studies? Or where would you locate the beginnings of the modern field of feminist studies? And what major advances, arguments have marked its development? And start to think about where those questions intersect. So answers means the full drafted page by page response that you might prepare, whereas answer steps are more flexible in terms of answering pieces of the questions that may have overlap. So the first question is about, how do practitioners do cultural studies? The second question is, where do you locate the beginnings of modern field of feminist studies, and what major advances or arguments have marked its development? And so within this, there may be overlap of this question of what is cultural studies. In one case, maybe focusing on the research questions, methods, and uses to answer the question of how practitioners do cultural studies. In the case of the feminist studies question, highlighting historical moments, pivotal moves such as the Combahee River Collective Statement, or key texts. But the idea here is, whenever possible, if you have questions that will have in part some overlap in answers, you can prepare those answer steps or those pieces of the answers and just start writing about that. Examples of answer steps: descriptions of major works within your field, descriptions of major arguments, divisions, and conversations in your field, short responses analyzing the development of major theories and assumptions, analysis of the major methodological and analytical approaches in your field, strengths and weaknesses of those different approaches, the appropriateness of different approaches for answering different kinds of questions, descriptive histories relevant to your topics or subtopics, or descriptions of the major questions that motivate your field. While this may seem like a lot, and I'm sharing a lot of ideas of the types of answer steps you may prepare, I hope that instead of feeling overwhelming, that this helps you to see specifically where you can go to prepare some answer steps that will then translate to the responses you write in your qualifying exams. So knowing how to talk about major works, major arguments, the conversations, analyzing how theories have shifted or been refined over time, analyzing what methods are typically employed, or understanding how to engage with the history of the topics in your field is going to really be important. And, understanding how to identify the questions that the texts you're reading are asking is going to help you to better understand what questions motivate your field, and being able to engage with that. What is this field trying to understand is one of the most important, I found in my exploration, approaches to qualifying exams. We want to understand the field not for what they're saying, but what they're asking. Some of the next steps that I encourage you to take in preparation for quals, and namely developing questions and answers, is, again, connect with students in your program who have completed this process and ask them your questions. Maybe ask if they'll share a little bit of their process with you, and any tips and tricks that they had along the way. Schedule a meeting with the members of your committee to discuss potential questions and answers. I'm not sure where all of you are coming from, whether you're just starting this or you're somewhere along the way, but I will say making a timeline is important. And then making sure that part of that timeline is meeting with each committee member to discuss your questions, having time built in from that initial meeting for revisions before having a set deadline of when you want to have the questions prepared by. I believe, at least in my department, that the questions need to be submitted a month before the exam date. So knowing those dates from your handbook is going to be helpful to make sure that you have everything prepared so that you can be on schedule for what you expect for yourself. So when you're making that timeline, write down when you want to meet your committee members and maybe reach out and get those meetings on the books, so that you make sure you stay on time for things. And then schedule an appointment at the CWR to work on the organization and argumentation of your prepared answers. I don't say this just because I'm employed at the CWR. I say this as a student who uses the CWR at every stage of my entire, journey here at CGU. Meeting with consultants, talking about your work, talking about the organization, developing your argumentation is going to make what you come up with on the day of the exam better than if you only do this in isolation. Academic writing is not meant to be done in isolation, but so many of us are doing it this way because it's very isolating, and because especially with quals not requiring that you go into a class, you feel like you're on your own. Maybe you're not even near campus. I'm not. I'm on the East Coast. I'm in Massachusetts right now, and I did my quals from Massachusetts, so there's no access to campus and meeting with people and having that chance to interact in the same way in person, but finding those avenues through these resources, showing up for an appointment at the Writing Center, going to these weekends. I know you're all here, so you're already doing this type of work. So thank you. Thank you. And also I hope you thank yourself later, because this is the type of preparation that's going to make this process smoother for you. And then a few additional resources. So I had already shared with you the Canvas module related to today, but there is the entire Quals Prep weekend module in the Canvas page that you can access. If you're looking to make an appointment and you've never done so, cgu.mywconline.com is where you would go set up an account using your student email. And we offer one-on-one consultations as well as email review. For the case of qualifying exams, I would encourage a one-on-one consultation so that you can talk in real time with the consultant. We have folks taking appointments on campus in real life. Woo! And then we also have people conducting online appointments as well. So if you're not local or it's just too much of a burden to drive to campus just for an appointment, you can have one on the virtual interface, which is something like Zoom through WC Online, and it has a whiteboard or just like a blank screen that you can type and text and add your work to that. And then you're already here, so you know that the CWR has events, but continue to make these events part of your process. And I promise it will enhance your productivity along the way. So maybe after you finish this weekend, you'll reflect on your experience. And if it went well, you can go to our event page and sign up for another event later this semester, or maybe a few more events later this semester to help keep yourself on track and set that time. It also tends to seem, from my experience, that when we're in post-coursework, people who are not in graduate school or who have never endured graduate school don't quite understand what we're doing, and maybe don't take as seriously the boundaries that we set when we say, I need to write, I need to work on quals, I need to prepare. And so scheduling these events and being able to say, oh, I'm busy, I'm going to an event. For some reason, people take that more seriously and don't kind of give you that same kind of pushback. So setting that boundary for yourself will hold you accountable, but also allow you that space to say, I'm sorry, I can't, I have something going on that day. Awesome. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that the information I covered was helpful. I will stop the recording, but we can move into just a question and answer. But thank you. If you're looking for the handout, those of you watching the recording, it's on the CWR Canvas page. Thank you.